Chapter 1. Arrival. Paolo stood on the deck of the steamship SS Laconia, which was anchored in New York Harbor. He was trying to see the island, but it was covered with morning mist. It almost seemed dangerous, lurking in the water like a sea monster. Paolo was very nervous, and the worst part was, he didn't know why. Paolo coughed. His cough was getting worse. It was the air down in steerage, he thought. Deep down in the ship was a large open area filled with bunk beds. It was called steerage. Paolo and his parents had spent the trip from Italy in this big room. It was crowded with immigrants who couldn't afford the expensive tickets. Paolo went up on deck to get a breath of air whenever he could. The air blowing in from the ocean was a relief. Now their long journey was over. Today, Paolo and his family would arrive in the United States. Paolo hurried down to see if his family was awake yet. Paolo's mother, Maria, was getting breakfast ready. She was slicing meat and a bit of bread saved from dinner the night before. "Where have you been?" she asked, kissing him. "Find your father and tell him that breakfast is almost ready." Paolo's father, Lorenzo, was talking with the other men. "We were thrown off our land," Lorenzo was saying. The rest of the men nodded sadly. They were farmers too. One man was cutting pieces from a wrinkled old apple. He popped the pieces into his mouth one at a time. "Why did they kick you out?" he asked. "The landlord raised our rent," said Lorenzo. "We couldn't pay rent that high and eat too. So I asked other farmers to refuse to work until we got a fair deal." "Ah," said the man. "In the United States, they call that a strike." "For that, I was thrown off the land my father had farmed, my grandfather and his father too," Lorenzo said. A man in a battered hat spoke up. "Here it's better. They have something called unions." "What are they?" asked Paolo. "A group of workers. They stand by each other and bargain with the factory owners. I don't think the farmers have a union, though." "We should have one, eh, Paolo?" exclaimed Lorenzo. Then he and Paolo went to get breakfast. Paolo's mother was worried. "Lorenzo, don't talk politics. I overheard a woman saying that they don't want troublemakers here. Workers in Pennsylvania have tried to start a boycott, whatever that is." "It's when you refuse to buy things from someone who is treating you unfairly," said Paolo. Maria smiled and shook her head. "Not you too," she looked at Lorenzo. "See?" "All right," he said, "but I won't lie. If I am asked what I think, I'll tell them." "Really, Lorenzo?" Maria said. "Don't say this to the Americans on the island." The island was called Ellis Island. A man on the ship had told Paolo it was the gateway to the New World. Paolo couldn't sit still. He decided to walk around the ship and visit his friends. It would take his mind off his worries. One thing he loved about life on the ship was the opportunity to make new friends. The ship was so crowded that he had to squeeze between people. He kept saying, "Excuse me, excuse me." It took a long time to get from one place to another. He recognized a family from Calabria. Paolo was from Sicily. This family had 2 children. The adults were a little older than Paolo's parents, and they seemed very nice. At night, the mother would sing for her children. She had a beautiful voice. Paolo wanted to get to know them. His mother, however, had told Paolo to stay away from them. "One of the boys has a sickness in his eye," she said. "You might catch it. Sometimes they keep people out of the United States for being sick, you know." His mother was always afraid that they wouldn't be allowed into the United States. Paolo suddenly felt like coughing. As he fought the urge, his face turned red and his body shook with the effort. Finally, the tickle in his chest went away. Paolo didn't want his mother to know he had a cough. Chapter 2. The Gateway. Paolo and his parents walked up to the main building on the island. The building was made of red bricks with a border of white stone. They walked with hundreds of people, maybe thousands. All of them were carrying everything they owned. The day was very hot. Paolo's father laughed. "They call this hot? We're from Sicily. Now that's hot." Paolo smiled, but privately he thought he had never been so hot in his life. Maybe it was because his mother had made him wear the extra clothes that couldn't fit in the suitcases. The ships unloaded travelers from all over the world. Paolo could tell the people were from many different countries by the languages they spoke. So many languages. Everyone was chattering away, wondering what would happen next. As newcomers poured into the building, the people there told them to leave their baggage in a special room. Paolo didn't like leaving his belongings with strangers, but there was no other choice. They followed the crowds to a stairway that went up to the 2nd floor. Here they were told they had to separate. The men went one way, the women and little children another. Maria didn't like this. Maria pleaded, "He's only 12 years old. Can't he stay with me?" The man in charge just pushed Paolo and Lorenzo along with the other men and boys. "Don't worry, Maria," called Lorenzo. "We'll see you soon." Paolo was carried along by the steady stream of men. He tried to keep his mother in sight, but soon she was gone. Chapter 3. Caught. When Paolo walked into the great hall, he gasped. He had never seen such a large room. His father said, "They do things big in the United States, eh?" Paolo was so shocked, he coughed before he could stop himself. The cough was so bad that tears came to his eyes. When he stopped coughing, Paolo saw his father bending over him, looking concerned. Then Paolo saw an officer in uniform coming toward him. The officer called out to a tall young woman. She was pretty, and Paolo hoped she was also kind. The officer spoke to her in English. The woman turned to Paolo and said in Italian, "Hello, I'm Mrs. Alfieri. He wants to know how long you've had that cough." Paolo couldn't lie and disappoint his father. "For a week," he said, feeling hopeless. "I caught it on the boat." Mrs. Alfieri said, "When you are finished with medical inspection, wait for me." She smiled as Paolo nodded. "Don't worry, I'm sure it's just a cough." She showed Paolo and his father where to go for the medical examination. There was a long line of men and boys standing between rails. Paolo thought, maybe the rails are there to keep us from escaping. Then Paolo saw that he was standing behind the boy with the eye sickness. Paolo tried to see what was going on at the head of the line. When the next man's turn came, a doctor studied him. Then he did something to his face. Paolo asked his father what was happening. "I think he's looking at his eyes," Lorenzo said. When Lorenzo said this, the boy with the sick eye turned around. He looked very worried. When it came time for the boy to be examined, he was trembling. Paolo was afraid of him. It was a long trip back to Italy, and Paolo wondered if his whole family would go back with him or if he would go alone. Paolo would hate to take the long trip by himself. The doctor held something in his hand. He put it to the boy's face and looked at the boy's eye. Then he grunted and picked up a piece of chalk. He made a mark on the boy's jacket with the chalk. "Eye infection," the doctor said. An officer took the boy by the arm and led him away. The boy's father followed, calling out, "What is the problem?" "It's nothing, a sore eye, that's all." Paolo looked at his father. Lorenzo smiled sadly and patted his son's cheek. "Paolo, don't be afraid. Always do what you know is right and things will turn out well." Someone called loudly, "Next!" Paolo turned and walked to the desk. The doctor quickly looked Paolo over. Then he examined Paolo's right eye. Before Paolo could say anything, the doctor looked into the other eye. The doctor motioned for Paolo to open his shirt. Paolo obeyed. The doctor took something out of his medical bag. It had 2 long black tubes with a small bell-shaped object at the end of it. Paolo had seen this thing before. Doctors listen to your chest with it. The doctor said something in English. Paolo didn't understand. He shrugged and looked around for help. Luckily, Mrs. Alfieri was right there. "Take a deep breath, Paolo." Paolo did, making a great effort not to cough. The doctor frowned. Mrs. Alfieri whispered into the doctor's ear. Paolo felt betrayed. The doctor nodded and took out the chalk. He marked Paolo's jacket with the letter P. Paolo was afraid that he had been marked to be sent back to Italy, like some old package nobody wanted. Mrs. Alfieri said to Lorenzo, "I'm sorry, but Paolo will have to stay in our hospital for a few days." Paolo shivered. His worst fear had come true. He was going to be sent back to Italy. "But he's healthy," Lorenzo said. "He's never been sick." "I'm sure it's just a bad cold," said Mrs. Alfieri. "But there's been a lot of whooping cough and other diseases going around. Paolo will stay here on the island until we're sure it's nothing serious." Lorenzo was silent for a moment. Then he turned to his son. "Don't worry, Paolo. I'll find your mother and we'll stay here with you no matter how long it takes." Paolo tried to look braver than he felt. "It'll be all right, Papa." "You have to go to the legal inspection now, sir," said Mrs. Alfieri to Lorenzo. Paolo grabbed his father's sleeve and whispered, "Papa, please tell them we'll buy whatever they want us to." Lorenzo smiled. "Paolo, you know I won't lie." He patted his son on the head. "They ask what I think about unions. What can I do? I'm for them. Now be brave, Paolo. Everything will be well." Mrs. Alfieri took Paolo's hand and led him away. Chapter 4. The Hospital. When he first got to the hospital, Paolo's whole body shook with fear. He had never been in a hospital before. He didn't know what to expect. The hospital was crowded, but it was clean, and there were windows so he could see the sun. The nurses and doctors were good to him and the other patients. Paolo was in the hospital for 3 days. The boys and men on his ward came mostly from Germany. They chatted happily all day. It made Paolo feel very lonely and afraid. He reminded himself constantly of the courage his father always showed. Paolo remembered that his parents would want him to be brave. This kept his spirits up. The worst thing was not knowing what had happened to his father. There was no one he could ask. No one spoke Italian. Paolo prayed that his family wouldn't be sent back to Italy. Paolo was happy when Mrs. Alfieri arrived to visit him. "Paolo, the doctor tells me you are getting well." "I'm much better," Paolo said. "What's happened to my father?" "Your father is fine," Mrs. Alfieri said. "Your mother, too. I wanted to—" "Did Papa get into trouble?" Paolo blurted out. "You're worried about your Papa?" Mrs. Alfieri asked. "Well, get dressed and we'll go see if we can find him." The longest walk Paolo had ever taken was the walk back to the immigration building with Mrs. Alfieri. Then he saw his parents sitting with their bags near the entrance. His mother and his father jumped up and Paolo threw himself into their arms. "That's what we like to see," said Mrs. Alfieri. "A happy ending." "Will we have to go back to Italy?" Paolo asked his father. "What? After all the trouble we've gone through to get here? No, we're going to be Americans now." Mrs. Alfieri told them that first they had to finish getting their papers in order and then they were free to go. "You're here to stay now, Paolo," laughed Mrs. Alfieri. "We'll make an American citizen of you yet."